Hey.
Hey, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good.
How are you? Good to see you.
My pleasure. Actually,
How are you?
not very well, because I wasn't
Hi. Can we get this notes?
memorial lecture.
Okay.
And then I'll
Okay, good.
every year.
Oh, yeah? Who does?
Well, thanks. Good.
Adding a prize to it.
It feels like
It's all perfect.
That's certainly.
So are you excited?
I'll be chewing my nails.
Yeah.
The talk I was at this morning.
So
Those of you who are baseball fans, not everybody is now baseball fans.
I'm in, but no.
I actually don't have people
On the main campus.
so I just saw the highlights.
Was that right? Yeah, the old video edits, right?
Game. Good game if you're not actually emotionally involved. So are you going back tonight?
No, actually, I'm hanging around for a few days because we're having PhD stuff.
Oh,
You know, PhD is effectively relocated to Mount Sinai.
I didn't know that.
The short answers are, I think, George, I fed up. Bear shot through a ton of money at Jason. Hotel. So,
The long answer is probably more interesting. A friend of mine once said, footnotes.
yeah, so we're gonna actually.
So what does that mean? Physical testing or
No. So, we will meet at a nice restaurant on Colony Train. The next day. Well, you know, I'm just carving out the hair. Oh, yeah.
My children catch their chances. Scottish, Irish, German, and some they declare themselves Irish. I'm like, no. You can't write me out of the equation, right? Right? But this is not. This is Russian. This is some like Cossack that got in there. So
You don't know that.
come on. So, you can't do this. Like, they're like, half Irish.
What's his name?
Yes. Anyway, the thing was the funny thing is this kid decided to declare that.
Yeah.
And they take it quite seriously.
All right, so more people will be drifting in, and we're having a technical problem. There were some people who wanted to listen in through that phone line, but we're having a problem getting a dial tone. But that's not a reason not to start for those of you who are here on time, which is appreciated. This is the first in our series of seminars this year on ethical, legal, and social implications of genetics. We will be meeting monthly from now on. The next session, just to give you a preview, is on November 19th. Sarah Richardson in the Department of History of Science at Harvard will be coming, and she will be talking about her current work looking at the implications for women, for mothers, of the current focus on epigenetic influences on child rearing, and what it means when you suggest to a society that every little thing that you do with your kids could alter their genomic expression and impact the rest of their lives. Sounds like a fascinating topic, and I'm really looking forward to her presentation. Today, however, I'm delighted to welcome Misha Angrist. Misha, who came up from Duke to be with us today, is Associate Professor of Practice in the Social Science Research Institute, Senior Fellow in the Program in Science and Society at Duke, a long-time and well-known commentator on issues related to genetics and genomics, having gotten his PhD in genetics from Case Western Reserve University, his master's in genetic counseling from the University of Cincinnati, and his MFA from Bennington, not necessarily in that order, but with that package makes him sort of a unique person in the constellation of folks who comment on, think about, write about, and influence the development of genomic policy today. Misha's book, which I wholeheartedly recommend to you, is called Here is a Human Being at the Dawn of Personal Genomics. It is ostensibly about his experience as the fourth subject in the Personal Genome Project, but it is really a history of the development of genomics and the capacity to sequence the genome from its inception until the book was published in 2010. Is that right? Is that when it came out? And it's a wonderful read. You'll see that those folks running the MFA program at Bennington did a great job, and I commend it to you wholeheartedly. It's published by Harper. I don't know if that means you can or can't buy it on Amazon these days, but
it's out of print, so you might as well go on, Adall or eBay or something.
Okay, so boycott Amazon, but find the book, because it's a terrific book. And his topic today, which is not exactly what it says on the slide there, so I'll read what's on the slide there. Whoops, please don't say mañana, the unsustainability of current human genomic research governance. Misha, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. It was kind of weird having my book published by HarperCollins, but I sort of feel like, it went out of print and it didn't sell very many copies, so I was doing my part to help bring down Rupert Murdoch. So it's wonderful to be here. I have been Applebaum and Klitzman fans for a long time, and I sort of feel like, I've been invited to sit at the grown-ups table at the Seder. So it's really nice. So let's get started. This is my disclosure slides, really. I work for Duke. You may be surprised that I work for Duke after some of what I say. My work's supported partly by NIH. I'm As Paul said, I'm a participant in the Personal Genome Project, and I sit on the board of directors, and I do some unpaid consulting work. And I use that very loosely because not only do I not get paid, I don't even really get asked very often what I think. I served on the Duke IRB for 5 years, and for all I know, I will do so again. I think I left on good terms. Again, a little foreshadowing. I now serve on the Genetic Alliance IRB, though we can't seem to find a time to meet. And I'm still trying to figure out how to monetize this thing. So the real disclosures are that to the extent that what I say today is encumbered by data, it is data that is selective, cherry-picked, biased. It is from my solipsistic view at Duke University. So just keep that in mind. I am interested in producing generalizable knowledge, which is the IRB definition of research, but I would really like the people I study to be happy. And I use the word governance in the title. And I was thinking about this the other day because I was talking to my students, my first-year undergraduates, about the Catalona case, which I won't go into, but it was a case involving ownership of tissue. You know, does tissue and DNA and biological data belong to the institution, or does it belong to the specific researcher? And the outcome of the case sort of hinged on what the IRB said and what was in the consent form. And I asked my students to write about this, and they acted as though IRBs were handed down by God. You know, that it wasn't only an act of Congress, but it was actually a divine act. And I just said, you know, if God created IRBs, then that was not his best day. But I think it's important, I put this up as a reminder to myself, that governance is not only about laws, rules, divine or otherwise. It's about norms, it's about the way things get done, self-censorship, and just the way we tend to behave once things get instantiated and institutionalized. Okay, so before he became a multinational corporation, and before he had his DNA genotyped to show conclusively that he is not related to Warren Buffett, Jimmy Buffett was actually a pretty good songwriter, and he wrote a song called Mañana. Please don't say mañana if you don't mean it. Don't try to describe the scenery if you've never seen it. So I put this up here because I'm interested in how we do research, what we say to participants, what we put in the large print and what we put in the fine print. Ours is a promissory enterprise, and by that I mean genomics, genetics, but I think probably that's true of most biomedical research. So anyone who gives a talk in this field is contractually obligated to show this slide. I can't think of the last talk that I went to that didn't have some version of this. And so I put it here, I guess, like the good sheep that I am. But because it's really unavoidable that DNA sequencing has gotten so cheap, and so you see that nice downward sloping curve of Moore's law showing how cheap it's become to compute And then you see DNA sequencing falling off the ledge there in 2006-ish, and just becoming much cheaper by orders of magnitude, to the tune of $1,000. So this is, one might argue, our field's greatest achievement. We can decode DNA at some tiny, tiny fraction of a penny per base. And when you think about 1990, when the Human Genome Project started, more or less, it was $10 a base. So that's amazing. But that's not enough. We have to say other stuff to really sell it. And I like to show these quotes of what people said just as the Human Genome Project was getting going. So James Watson said, "We used to think our fate was in our stars. Now we know in large measure our fate is in our genes." And Eric Lander, arguably an even more important figure in the Genome Project, said, "It's a medical revolution that holds the prospect that our children's children will never die of cancer." So this is what I call setting the bar very high. I think the problem is we then are tied to that. We put that kind of stuff in our grant proposals and we talk about it in front of Congress. And some of our colleagues tell us that we need to be part of this. Scientific research is a moral duty. We are obligated to participate. So Zeke Emanuel wants us to participate in research before we die at age 75. I don't know if those two things are related. So I struggle to reconcile these ideas with the way we actually do research and the way we treat people who participate in it, at least in some of the settings that I've witnessed and I've been in. So, this is not a universal truth. So folks in this room have shown us that researchers are actually interested in sharing information with the people they study, not being aloof, not keeping them at arm's length. And so this table, I think, is compelling because what it says is a high number of researchers, a high proportion of researchers, are actually interested in sharing genetic information that is highly penetrant, meaning very likely to manifest, for which there is no treatment. Nearly 2 out of 3 would share that information if they detected it in a family's fetus. And they have thought about how we might change the consent process to make this information available. And so I put this stuff up here not merely to suck up to my hosts, but because I think it's actually, these are the kinds of conversations that I wish we had more of. So here's my story. It's one of several I like to tell. So this is 2012. I ask you to get in the Wayback Machine. This was before the American College of Medical Genetics published its guidelines saying we should return certain actionable alleles to people who undergo clinical sequencing. This was explicitly a research study. I was sitting on the Duke IRB at the time, and this was the protocol I was asked to review involving a biobank. So what are biobanks? Well, they are essentially collections of human biological stuff, information, data, tissue, samples. They may include any or all of that. And we like to keep them in one place. We like to aggregate our data so that it's more powerful. We can draw more robust conclusions from it. But if you ask people in the field who do biobanking, some of them, there was a paper in Clinical Genetics last year, they don't even like the word, because the word biobank connotes certain obligations. We have to issue consent forms, that kind of thing. But I like this definition from the guy who runs the RUCDR, which is Rutgers' answer to the Coriell Institute, the largest university-based biorepository. It is a science and a business. And I like this definition because it's succinct and I think it's honest. Okay, so what's my deal? I'm not going to ask you to read this, but this was the protocol I was asked to review in 2012, and here's what it said. We are here to mine your tissue and your data. Your, meaning you cancer patients. You're not going to get anything from that. We are going to try to monetize your samples because biobanking is a science and a business. And we're going to ask you to consent to allow us to do that in perpetuity. But you'll never see your own data. You will be de-identified for your own good. If you get injured in our study, we will treat you. We happen to be a world-class academic medical center, we like to tell ourselves, but we're going to send the bill to you or your insurer. But hey, at least you're not giving up any of your rights.
This is at Duke, yeah?
Yes. We're following the rules, and you are not waiving any of your rights. So I was quite naive, and I just remember thinking, well, that can't be right. That just doesn't seem fair. And so I wrote the PI, and I said, can we include a statement? Can we include a proviso that says, you know, once a year we will send participants something that tells them what has become of their samples, who's studying it, what they're studying, and just say thank you. His response was, you know, I can't do that. I might be able to pull together a yearly newsletter and a list of publications, but, you know, if all goes well, I'm going to have 600 people in this protocol, and it's just not practical. And anyway, if I start giving them information about what's actually being done with their samples, then they're going to hassle me. And, you know, that's not what this is. This is research, and I can't be holding hands with participants. I said, okay, what about this? We will leave the PI's name off. So, you know, Duke is this clearinghouse. The samples go to some other institution doing studies of prostate cancer or rheumatoid arthritis or whatever it is. And we send that once a year. Let me think about it, he said. We may not actually know what the people we've sold these samples to are doing. You know, it's up to them. We are a disinterested third party, you know, whatever filthy lucre we happen to be generating. And, you know, this is just not something I have any incentive to do. I said, okay, I don't give up. Yeah, Bob.
You said that Duke sells the data then?
Well,
How does that work?
there were presumably going to be access fees.
To industry, not to researchers, in other words, not to researchers at Duke.
I don't know. That was not specified in the protocol. That's a good question. I said, okay, I can work with this. We don't have to know in any sort of detailed way what investigators are doing. We can just cut and paste. This research on these samples still has to be IRB approved. So let's just say what's going on. I said, I think this idea of a Christmas card saying thank you to people involved in this study once a year is a nice thing to do. And I think it generates goodwill. And that was it. He stopped answering my email, and the IRB met, and I was on the losing end, I think, of an 18-1 vote. Everybody else was fine with this protocol. Yeah?
Was there any criteria for investigators to access the samples, like a review board or some quality
Sure,
control?
yes. So each project had to have its own IRB approval. So
They just had to show the RB approval, and then, so the biobank
Yes.
didn't have to really judge as long as they had the RB approval.
right. So this article appeared a couple months ago about something called the Murdoch study, set in Kannapolis, North Carolina. Kannapolis was for a long time the site of a textile mill, and that was the overwhelming source of economic activity in the town, and the mill closed, and there wasn't a lot going on, and a guy named David Murdoch came in. He is the heir to the Dole Foods fortune, and very interested in health and longevity, and takes a lot of supplements, and he gave Duke $35 million to set up this study. And the study was essentially designed, and is designed, to become a biobank, enrolling as many people who live in Kannapolis as possible, and to collect their blood and their urine and their medical history and their electronic health records. Samples would be de-identified. Participants would be contacted once a year for additional information. Obviously, if they're de-identified, there were no plans to give them any sort of results. Consent, again, broad, open-ended. Duke created a spin-off company called the Biomarker Factory. I think that's kind of an unfortunate name, but okay. Participants would not have any share in that, but they would get a $10 Walmart gift card. So this idea has actually persisted in Google Baseline, which you may have read about, which initially is going to enroll 175 people. Same deal. I don't know if they get a Walmart gift card, but they would be de-identified and get no personal results. And this is exactly what it says. The idea is we will create a baseline of a healthy person and use that to seed further research. So the problem with de-identification, as you may know, is DNA is inherently identifying, and much, but by no means all of that has to do with this guy, Yaniv Ehrlich, at the Whitehead in Cambridge, Mass., who essentially took information from so-called anonymous genomic research databases and using online search tools was able to re-identify supposedly anonymous people. And the reason this was a big deal when it was published early in 2013 was it simply mined data that was freely available and not restricted on the web. So this prompted something of hand-wringing at NIH and has made us rethink, or at least pay lip service to the idea that we can't really promise de-identification or anonymity in any assured way. Okay, another example. I'll stop picking on Duke for a moment and pick on the military. Military is interested in having a biobank with 1 million samples in it. One can imagine how useful this would be if you want to study, say, PTSD. You have a very well understood, heavily tracked population. You have a fair amount of control, or at least when they're in active service, a fair amount of control over what they do and where they go and that sort of thing. And you know, it was and is meant to be a state-of-the-art database. And to the military's credit, it contracted the services of the Genetics and Public Policy Center based in DC, and said, go out and ask veterans what they think of this idea. And they were generally keen, but 2/3 said they would be less likely to participate if they didn't get research results back. 90% said they would want to know all of their research results. So this was the answer they got in 2009, but MVP is not returning any results. We are legally unable to do so because the samples will not be processed in a so-called CLIA lab, a clinically certified lab. So I don't want to fall too far down this rabbit hole, but legal scholar Barbara Evans has argued that, you know, is this really a deal breaker? Is CLIA certification necessary for returning results to individual patients? When we can't know for certain what the intent of the recipient is.
What is CLIA?
It is the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments of 1988, which is a set of standards that laboratories that process clinical samples have to meet. It's not that high a standard because there's a couple 100,000 CLIA labs the world over. Okay, so one of the things that this debate gets at is, what is a research sample versus a clinical sample? Is it merely the fact that in one instance someone's genome gets sequenced in a CLIA lab and in another it happens in a research lab? So I'm not going to get deeply into this, but a number of us in the field have started to push back against this idea because there simply is no compelling data that people who participate in research studies are at greater risk than people who get treated by their doctors. That medicine has a fair amount of uncertainty attached to it as well. And Layla Jamal and I, she's at Johns Hopkins, have written about this with respect to sequencing studies in particular, where in some cases, so-called research studies are nevertheless being done in clinical labs and results are being returned to participants. And in other cases, such as the study I'm involved with at Duke, we don't return whole exome or whole genome results to participants. If we have a particular result that is of clinical import, then we have it genotyped or sequenced in a CLIA lab. So all of that is very inside baseball. But our point is simply, if we keep these distinctions hard and fast, then arguably both enterprises suffer. If we don't have access to clinical data because it's hidden for commercial reasons, such as the case with Myriad Genetics and its breast cancer susceptibility allele data, or researchers don't deposit their data in databases because maybe they're worried about liability, then the community loses. We don't have as much data. It's harder to make sense of. Obviously, if you're worried about getting the powers that be on your case because you're not a clinical lab, then you're not going to want to incur that risk. Okay, so why does this matter? The NIH has long had an interest in people sharing data, and it has sought to balance that impulse with the prospect of people who don't want to be identified being identified. Last month, it finalized, I would use that in air quotes, its data sharing policy, and it said you have to tell research participants, particularly in large-scale sequencing studies, that their samples and their information could be used broadly, even if your particular study is for one particular thing. And this applies to samples that are supposedly de-identified. So what I find interesting is they want us to get consent for de-identified samples because of what Yaniv Ehrlich showed, that we can now re-identify people simply based on DNA sequence. At the same time, the policy says we expect the return of individual findings to be rare because investigators will not be able to return individual results directly to a participant, as neither they nor the repository will have access to the identities of participants. So in other words, the risk of re-identification is serious enough to require consent, but not serious enough to actually try to share it with the people from whom it came. So one of the responses to the paper by the group here that I showed earlier was this question of what is informed consent and what do we ask it to do, and is it realistic? This is from Barbara Koenig. I understand the desire to get consent right. There is magic in consent. When fully realized, it is a communicative act that alters moral relations, authorizing activities that would otherwise be forbidden. My view, though, is that the focus on consent in contemporary biomedical research has become the modern equivalent of a fetish, meaning something we attribute magic to. I don't know if that's true. I think of it as an overstuffed closet. It's not that it's magic. It's that we always feel like we can just stuff one more thing in there. We can ask it to do something else, and we can wedge the door shut and feel better about ourselves. So what does genomic data sharing have to do with me? I mentioned that I'm part of a research study. We do whole exome sequencing of families with undiagnosed, usually babies and children, occasionally fetuses, occasionally adults. And so we get back 60 million base pairs. We're typically only interested, shouldn't say, we are first and foremost looking for one particular causative allele, one, maybe 2 or 3 broken genes that are responsible for this child's condition. But of course, we get all this other stuff back. And so this was a letter we got last year from one of the mothers in our study. I understand there is ambiguity with regard to what information should be returned to participants in genome research studies. So already I love her because she gets it. She understands what we're up against. We had conversations about the rules and the IRB and CLIA and all of this stuff. But she pushed. We were told there were incidental findings for my son, but they were not pertinent to his present condition. So we were not told what these incidental findings were. Who determines what you deem important to my medical care or my son's medical care? As a mother, I am ultimately responsible for my son's health and well-being. I would like a digital copy of my and my son's genome data. You know, I'm at once torn. I'm standing on the sidelines cheering her on, and my heart is breaking because I can't give her these things because Duke won't let me. We waited 317 days before the IRB would let us have open communication with our participants. We're now at a place where for so-called medically relevant information, we're allowed to give it back. But we're still figuring out what that even means and how to get the IRB's blessing. So, second Southern white guy, songwriter. The difference is this guy's still good, Dr. John. And he has a song called Such a Night in which he says, if I don't do it, somebody else will. We're in this position because people are different, which is banal, of course, but no less true for being banal. So my friend and colleague Michelle Meyer has written eloquently about this. And if you like long and penetrating legal policy articles, I highly recommend this one. And she talks about the heterogeneity problem, simply this idea that the IRB can't deal with people wanting different things. And so as a matter of convenience and facility, it simply opts for the lowest common denominator, and everybody gets nothing and likes it. And of course, she, like I, sees this as a degradation of research and lost opportunities. I think she probably sees it more as lost opportunities for doing cool kinds of research. I see it as a lost opportunity to actually engage with participants as people and figure out what they want. So, how do people respond to this forced homogeneity? Thankfully, in some very creative ways. So Sharon Terry, who runs the Genetic Alliance, developed Reg for All, a database, I shouldn't say a database, a portal designed to give research participants control over who gets to study their sample and what they get to use it for. And it is essentially the sort of staged consent that Klitzman and Applebaum and Chung describe instantiated. Mike Moonshot and Holly Tabor at University of Washington have a sort of direct-to-consumer-like portal for their exome sequencing participants. And they say, we contend that an approach to managing whole exome, whole genome results that preserves the right of individuals to full disclosure of access in meaningful genetic information according to their own preferences is the most effective way to respect the four main principles of bioethics. So if you've seen 23andMe, you've seen something like what they call My46. You may have seen an article in the New Yorker a few months ago called 1 in a Million, which involved a bit of Duke drama. And it concerned primarily the Might family, whose child had a rare and for most of his short life undiagnosed condition, Bertrand Might. And what they pointed out in this commentary in Genetics and Medicine, so this by itself was already something unusual in that you had fathers of kids with an undiagnosed condition addressing an audience of geneticists. And what they said is 6 of the 8 patients presented in the accompanying article, so that was the primary paper based out of Duke, were linked together after parents, physicians, or scientists working on isolated cases searched online for NGLY1. NGLY1 was the broken gene of interest. They found a blog post describing the disorder written by the parents of the first confirmed patient, and that was Matt Might. And they say, look, the world has changed. You should share data more often, not less. You should share it early. You should listen to the people you study. They might actually know something. And you shouldn't screw around. If these kids are sick and suffering, it's not the time necessarily to be risk averse. They're unusual, I should say, because they have a lot of resources, the Mites and the Wilsies, and it's not clear how scalable that will be. And Laura Hercher, who's here in the audience, has written eloquently about that. And then, of course, there's the masses. Whatever one thinks of 23andMe, whatever reasons there are to make fun of the company, people are interested in this stuff, and we see this upward curve where they've genotyped 700,000 people. We can argue about how many of those people actually paid for the service, whether they knew what they were getting. But I think it would be unfair to dismiss all of them as genuinely not interested in their genomes or ignorant, and in some cases frustrated with other approaches, whether to ancestry, paternity, carrier status, that kind of thing. And then there's this. This picture just blows my mind every time I look at it. I don't know what to make of it. It seems like a bad idea. But I think we have to ask why this truck exists and what's going on in there and what it says about the state of our field and the way we share information and the way we acquire information. And what direction it should point us in, what questions it raises.
Do you know what immigration DNA is?
No. Is that a competitor?
No, it says there legal fraternity
Oh, yes.
immigration DNA.
I'm assuming that's you need to demonstrate a blood relationship for your green card or whatever.
People can come if you want to bring family members in. You have to prove they're family members. It's done through incredibly backlogged DNA. Strangely enough, seems to be more efficient in all the other countries where people are trying to get out of it.
So I think there are a lot of abiding questions. I think in the case of MVP, why spend all that money and ask people what they want if you really are not interested in what they have to say, and trying to honor that, or at least think about how you might do that? At what point do privacy and CLIA and the research treatment distinction become excuses not to talk to the people you study? What's going to happen when somebody is identified, not just as an academic exercise by some people in Boston, but there's a true breach of genomic information? I mean, there are breaches of medical information all the time, and bad things have happened, blackmail, that sort of stuff. Can we alter the consent process in ways that are meaningful to research participants? I think that's going to be really hard given the norms, given the governance as it exists, but that is absolutely no reason not to try. If we concede that there are risks in talking freely to research participants, can we also concede that there are benefits? So, of course, that is purely rhetorical. And addressed to certain people in Durham, North Carolina. So I will leave you with this. And thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to talk about whatever you want.
So we have time for your questions and comments.
I still don't understand why they couldn't just give the results of testing to individual patient, aside from obstinacy, or does this alter the research design? What's yielded? Why couldn't you do that?
Well, I've written and argued elsewhere. I didn't really get into it, but I think the biggest, and maybe Bob and Paul want to weigh in, I think the biggest limiting factor is resources. Bob and Paul and Wendy Chung have actually written about, they asked researchers, how would you go about doing this? And most of them said, well, I think we could get it done in less than 15 minutes. Is that fair? 30 minutes. Yeah, or your pizza's free, right? So I think that's naive. It's certainly based on our experience, 30 minutes that would be remarkable. So the system is, there are no incentives for researchers to do this, other than this kind of big picture squishy motivation that I'm talking about.
But one of the things you point out is, to a large extent, it's not even the researchers making the decisions. It's IRBs
Yes.
making decisions.
Right.
Using blanket policies. IRBs that are charged nominally with protecting human research subjects, making decisions based on assumptions about what kinds of harms are likely to flow from disclosure of information back to them, which really are not terribly well grounded in data, to the extent that there are data that actually contradict that presumption, and there aren't a lot of data, and yet, apart from the practicalities and the costs associated with verifying data and returning it to human subjects, which are real and would need to be taken into account, the presumptions of the IRBs are actually one of the major obstacles to doing that.
I have been gung-ho. I have been shouting about this from the mountaintops. But when I think about writing another amendment to our protocol to try to, push the ball forward another yard, I get this pit in my stomach because it's such a contentious thing, and it's never, obviously we don't want to have a rubber stamp. That would be pointless. But we have whatever the opposite of a rubber stamp is, which is this kind of self-perpetuating bureaucracy that makes these decisions about what people want without actually not even talking to them about what they want, but not even reading the literature about what they want. So.
Question. I just wanted to say that totally have me in agreement on the IRB and mission creep and all this. But so there's a difference between getting a right to recontact and a duty to recontact. So there's a difference between saying researchers are asking the IRB to allow them to recontact when they think it's important, and to ask people in advance, is it all right with you if I come back with you for information? And that has tons of advantages, and I'm totally in your camp. And establishing a duty to recontact, whereby there's sort of an unlimited and undefined responsibility to get back to people if you find anything important, which creates just really endless liabilities for anybody either doing the research or in a clinical role. When I talk to my students about setting up relationships with their patients, this is in a clinical setting,
right,
in a cancer setting, I'm like, you are damned if you tell them if something new comes up, I'll let you know. What a disaster. You can't reach half of them.
Right.
You're endlessly responsible. Something new comes up every 15 and a half minutes. There's no objective determinator of when is that important enough that you need to reject. You need to set up a situation where you're allowed to contact them, where they can get back in touch with you, where information can flow without setting up a situation where the researcher or the clinician is liable to contact somebody. And that's not the IRB's job, and they do a terrible, I couldn't agree with you more. It's really not well done at present, and I know a lot of people who've been in the position of being told by an IRB that they were not allowed to reach out to a patient with something that they thought was actually life-threatening, and it's very frustrating. And it's been written about a bunch of times.